Is social distancing here to stay, or are people in America inching closer to each other? New data from 15 million cell phones gives us some insight. NBC News correspondent Jacob Ward analyzed that data, and it looks like some Americans are gathering at pre-pandemic levels.
In the same way that you could look out at the empty streets and just feel that people were staying at home, it's possible now to look out and similarly feel that people are starting to move around again and come into contact with each other. Well, new data confirms that that's the case. After more than 2 months of largely staying at home and staying apart, Americans are going out and getting together again. And health officials are worried about what that is going to mean. An analytics and marketing company called Cubic uses opt-in anonymized location data from more than 15 million devices in the U.S. to track these trends. And they've just given NBC News a look at the data on our behavior between March 1st and June 2nd. Perhaps the most important thing they measured was how close we come to one another. If you look at this baseball diamond, the distance between me right now and home plate is about 50 feet. And that's what they used as a measure of close contact. If I and another person were about this far apart from one another, we'd be considered having come close to one another. Now, that's about 10 times what the CDC recommends in terms of social distancing, but it's a really important measure of how our behavior is changing. And here's what they found. Contact levels were low nationally. We did really well staying home when we were told to. That's the good news. But contact is creeping back up. And in some parts of the country, it's at or above where it was before the pandemic. Counties like San Francisco, where I am, and which locked down first, had very similar rates to Brooklyn and Los Angeles County. But in several counties in Missouri, which saw a spike during Memorial Day, contact rates were higher than they were before the pandemic. In Arizona, counties like Navajo and Gila County, where new cases have spiked, mobility numbers have also gone back to nearly normal. In fact, 10.8 million Americans across nearly 500 counties are going out and seeing other people at or near pre-pandemic levels. Now, it's not yet clear whether staying at home and staying apart are connected to lower transmission rates, but what the data does show is that by and large, we did a great job as a nation with the hard work of isolating ourselves, and we're still out and about at only about 50% the rate we were in February. Still, the fear is that our infection and fatality numbers may go up. We have a full look at just how much Americans are going out and coming near one another on NBCNews.com.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.